Late July 1944. After 7 weeks of attrition in the Norman hedgerows, the front finally gives way. What had been a war of fields and fences becomes, almost overnight, a war of movement. American armor pushes through the shattered bocage south of St. Lo, engines grinding forward into open country that had been denied to them since D-Day. Behind the tanks come trucks, fuel, engineers, radios, logistics unleashed. The map, long frozen by resistance, begins to blur at the edges. German situation reports change tone with unsettling speed. Words like halten and abdichten, hold, seal, disappear. In their place comes something more ominous: folgen begrenzen, contain the consequences. The language itself admits what the front lines no longer can, that the breach is real, and that it is widening faster than orders can keep up. In East Prussia, Hitler rejects the vocabulary of retreat outright. Withdrawal, to him, is not a maneuver, but a confession. He demands a counterstroke that will restore the shape of the war with a single decisive motion. On paper, the idea is simple. Strike west from Mortain, sever the American corridor at Avranches, and cut Patton's Third Army off from its lifeline. A clean line drawn across a map, promising clarity where the battlefield offers none. Mortain is chosen not for its size, but for its position. A modest town at the hinge of the Allied breakout, it sits astride the narrow roads that funnel traffic toward Brittany and the Loire. If those roads can be cut, the thinking goes, the breakout can be strangled. A small place, burdened with a very large expectation. The camera, if there were one, would not linger on banners or speeches. It would follow asphalt and dirt, bridges and intersections. Because in mechanized war, roads decide whether armies advance or starve. They determine speed, density, and exposure. They decide how long a timetable can survive contact with reality. Somewhere behind the front, a German staff officer begins to assemble that timetable. Distances are measured, hours are allocated, columns are assigned to roads that appear clear on the map. The schedule assumes cooperation, from weather, from traffic, from friction itself. It assumes that time is neutral. This is where the story begins. Not with an explosion, but with a calculation. Because in a war governed by engines and radios, a miscalculation does not need to be large to be fatal. Sometimes it is only the width of a clock's hand, and the belief that it will arrive exactly where commanded. On the 2nd August 1944, the directive arrives at headquarters along the collapsing Western Front. Its language is firm, almost serene. A counterattack is to be launched between Mortain and Avranches. The objective is explicit: drive to the coast, cut the American spearhead, sever Patton's advance before it can harden into permanence. The order reads as if the situation was stable enough to permit ambition. At the field level, commanders read it differently. They do the arithmetic instinctively. Fuel stocks are thin and unevenly distributed. Divisions exist on paper more than in reality, hollowed by weeks of fighting in the hedgerows. Roads are clogged with retreating units, supply traffic, and the debris of earlier engagements. Every kilometer forward will have to be earned twice, once against the enemy and once against exhaustion. Yet the order allows no room for that calculus. It is written in certainty, not conditional clauses. Doubt, in this system, is not analysis, but attitude. To question feasibility is to question resolve, and resolve has become the last currency Berlin believes it can still spend. The document moves downward through the chain of command, losing none of its confidence along the way. The plan itself asks for incompatible virtues. It demands speed and surprise, yet also mass, concentration of armor sufficient to punch through and exploit. In Normandy, these qualities rarely coexist. Speed exposes columns to air attack. Mass slows movement and reveals intention. The order treats them as complementary, as if the terrain will politely step aside. Panzer units are gathered from across the front, assembled like broken tools collected into one final kit. Some arrive under strength, others with unfamiliar replacements. Crews work quietly, checking engines, loading ammunition, repairing what can still be repaired. There is no sense of preparation for triumph, only preparation. The atmosphere is professional, almost austere. Briefings are short. Maps are marked carefully. Men speak in terms of routes, timings, objectives, not outcomes. Victory is absent from the vocabulary. So is defeat. What remains is obligation. The attack is framed not as a chance to win, but as something that must be attempted because there is nothing else left to offer. As the order settles into the units tasked to carry it out, the pressure becomes palpable. This is not an operation born of opportunity. It is a response to crisis, dressed in the language of decisiveness. The counterattack moves forward not on confidence, but on necessity. Its momentum driven by the fear of what happens if it does not. And somewhere between Mortain and Avranches, the roads that must carry this decision wait in silence, already narrowing the margin for error. Before the first engine turns over, before the first column forms on a Norman road, a crucial fact has already changed hands. German intentions, once confined to maps and orders, are intercepted, assembled, and understood by Allied intelligence in time to matter. There is no dramatic reveal, no moment of alarm. The knowledge settles quietly, like a weight placed on a scale that will soon tip. At 1st Army Headquarters, Bradley's staff does not celebrate the advantage. They prepare. Air support is requested, timetables adjusted, liaison officers alerted. Nothing is rushed, because nothing needs to be. The attack, still unborn on the German side, is already being planned against. By the time the first tank moves, the response will not be improvised. It will be waiting. Across the lines, the Germans remain confident that secrecy holds. Their movements are masked by darkness, their orders restricted, their radios disciplined. Surprise, they believe, belongs to them. What they cannot see is the enemy reading their mail, translating intention into countermeasure long before contact is made. The illusion of concealment remains intact precisely because it has already failed. What follows is less a clash of units than a duel of systems. German planning depends on movement, columns advancing fast enough to outrun reaction. Allied planning depends on anticipation, positioning forces so that reaction becomes routine. One side must act perfectly to succeed. The other only needs to act on time. The miscalculation begins here, in the assumption that secrecy is a shield rather than a fragile hope. It is treated as a constant, not a variable. No allowance is made for interception, delay, or interpretation. The timetable moves forward as if unseen, unaware that it is already being measured from the opposite side. As night gathers over Mortain, the front appears calm. Roads are quiet. Villages settle into uneasy darkness. To the men who will advance before dawn, the stillness feels like confirmation, proof that surprise has survived intact. There is no visible sign that the enemy is preparing to meet them. But beneath that calm, the battlefield has already shifted. Aircraft are being readied, artillery zones are being reviewed, units are placed not where the Germans expect resistance, but where Allied planners know movement must pass. The attack, when it comes, will arrive into a space that has been shaped for it. This is the first invisible cut of the battle. Not steel against steel, but knowledge against assumption. The shock is already set, because the counterattack will begin against an enemy who is not surprised at all, but waiting. Hitler frames the counterattack not as a choice among options, but as a moral necessity. To retreat, in his view, is to accept decline as destiny. To strike back is to prove that will still governs events. The language surrounding Mortain reflects this conviction. The offensive is presented less as an operational calculation than as an act of faith, a demonstration that determination can still impose order on a collapsing front. From this belief, flow demands the battlefield cannot meet. More armor is required than can be assembled. More aircraft are expected than can be spared. Above all, more certainty is assumed than the situation can produce. The plan is constructed as if shortages are temporary inconveniences rather than structural facts. Where resources are lacking, confidence is substituted. Where time is short, urgency is declared sufficient. In the West, commanders understand the gap between instruction and reality. They see divisions that no longer resemble their tables of organization, fuel depots that empty faster than they can be replenished, and roads that choke movement even without enemy interference. Privately, many doubt the operation can succeed. Publicly, doubt has no function. The chain of command rewards compliance, not realism, and survival within it depends on presenting feasibility upward, not friction downward. Thus, the counterattack is sold as a turning point even as the front dissolves sideways. Maps are redrawn to emphasize opportunity rather than exposure. Reports accentuate readiness and minimize absence. What cannot be changed is reframed as what will not matter. The operation acquires momentum not because it convinces, but because it is repeated often enough to feel inevitable. The belief underpinning all of this is subtle and therefore dangerous, that willpower can substitute for logistics and timing can substitute for mass, that if the blow is struck quickly enough, it need not be struck strongly. This is not naivete so much as late war habit, a reliance on momentum and improvisation that once compensated for shortages, but now merely conceals them. On a staff table, a German officer calculates distances in kilometers. Mortain to Avranches to the coast. The numbers align cleanly. What they do not show are hedgerows that force vehicles into single file, villages that constrict movement, bottlenecks where one disabled truck can halt an entire column. Kilometers, on paper, are neutral. On the ground, they are weighted by terrain and watched by aircraft. This is where arrogance enters, not as boastfulness, but as assumption. The assumption that the battlefield will conform to intention, that the enemy will respond as expected, that delays will be recoverable and friction manageable. The plan does not ignore reality. It presumes reality will eventually yield. Such thinking has a cost. It narrows tolerance for deviation and leaves no margin for correction. When the plan is finally set in motion, it will require near-perfect execution to compensate for what it lacks in fuel, air cover, and reserves. Any delay, however small, will not merely slow the attack, it will expose the belief on which it rests. And as the columns prepare to move, that belief goes untested, intact and unquestioned, about to meet a battlefield that has learned repeatedly not to bend. The ground between Mortain and Avranches offers no sweep of open steppe, no room for dispersion or recovery. It is a corridor, narrow, constricted, and already scarred by weeks of movement. Roads thread through villages and hedgerows like arteries under pressure, converging at bridges and bends that compress speed into inevitability. What looks passable on a map becomes, on the ground, a sequence of funnels where movement can only occur in one direction, at one pace. Armor in this landscape cannot fan out. It must move in columns, and columns create their own mathematics of risk. Stop the led vehicle and everything behind it inherits the halt. Trap the tail, and the center has nowhere to go. In Normandy, a single disabled truck can immobilize a battalion's worth of steel. The corridor turns momentum into fragility, density into exposure. Every bridge becomes a decision point. Every ridge, a throttle on speed. Elevation that offers observation to one side offers targeting to the other. Villages constrict routes to a handful of streets, where turns are tight and withdrawal is awkward. The plan assumes these obstacles can be crossed quickly enough to preserve tempo, but tempo here is not an attribute, it is a condition. It exists only so long as motion remains uninterrupted. The schedule reflects this faith in continuity. Timings are built on average speeds, clean transits, and brief pauses. There is little allowance for blockage, breakdown, or counterfire. The corridor demands precision at every choke point, yet the plan treats friction as episodic rather than cumulative. Each delay is expected to be absorbed by acceleration later, as if the road ahead will offer repayment. German planners are not blind to the danger. Many have seen columns burned and bottled in this same terrain only weeks earlier. They understand that once committed, armour here cannot easily disengage. But the alternatives, yielding ground, abandoning the initiative, are framed as surrender by another name. Risk becomes acceptable not because it is small, but because refusal is unthinkable. This is the hidden rule of Normandy. Geography punishes optimism. The land rewards caution and preparation, not speed alone. It favors the defender who can predict movement and the attacker who can absorb interruption. In this corridor, optimism narrows margins instead of expanding them because it assumes the absence of interference in a place designed to produce it. As the staging areas fill and engines idle, the corridor waits. It is indifferent to intention. It will compress whatever enters it, expose whatever lingers, and magnify whatever goes wrong. The plan requires the corridor to behave like open country, fluid, forgiving, elastic. The corridor will do none of these things. What remains unspoken is the hour. Darkness can soften the corridor's teeth. Daylight sharpens them. Timing, already tight, becomes decisive. If the columns are still exposed when the light comes, the geometry of the land will be visible to more than just the men driving through it. The stage is set, not for collapse, but for a single decisive error, exposure at the wrong hour, in a place where there is nowhere else to go. Late on the 6th of August, as daylight fades and the final preparations are meant to lock into place, reports begin to arrive that disturb the timetable. Key elements are not yet fully concentrated. Columns are delayed by traffic, mechanical failures, and confusion at junctions where multiple units converge on the same narrow roads. The schedule, carefully assembled days earlier, begins to slip by minutes, then by hours. One decision follows another, each defensible in isolation, damaging in sequence. A commander hesitates to commit a unit before its flank is secured. Another waits for coordination that never quite arrives. These are not acts of cowardice, but of caution, attempts to reduce risk in an operation already defined by it. Yet the effect is cumulative. The opening thrust, which depends on simultaneity, begins to fragment. Still, the attack goes in. By this point, stopping has become politically impossible. To cancel would be to admit that the assumptions behind the order were flawed. To delay further would be to concede initiative without a fight. Even as tactical conditions deteriorate, momentum at the top demands motion at the front. The decision to start, once taken, can no longer be revisited. Surprise, in modern war, is a perishable commodity. It does not degrade gradually, it expires. A delay does not merely slow an attack, it spends the advantage on which the attack relies. Every hour lost is an hour gained by the enemy, whether visible or not. The Germans aim to win hours with speed and darkness. Instead, they donate them. As the night deepens, the fog of war thickens. Units move forward without clean synchronization, advancing on parallel roads that no longer align in time. Radio traffic increases, then fragments. Messages report progress and resistance in equal measure, without context. The sense of orchestration that the plan requires gives way to improvisation, and improvisation favors the side that is already prepared. What remains intact is belief. The conviction persists that surprise can still be recovered, that momentum can still be rebuilt once the attack is fully underway. This belief ignores a simple asymmetry. While the Germans are correcting their own delays, the enemy is not correcting anything. The enemy is adjusting to a plan it already understands. By the time engines finally surge forward in earnest, the timetable has lost its authority. What was meant to be a precise sequence has become a loose intention. The difference is not dramatic on the ground. Vehicles still move, orders are still given, but structurally it is decisive. The plan now requires everything else to go right, because time no longer will. This is the miscalculation in its purest form. The timetable was treated as a suggestion, flexible enough to absorb friction. The enemy, however, treats it as a target, something to exploit rather than obey. Each minute of delay sharpens that exploitation, turning preparation into prediction. As the first units cross their start lines under cover of darkness, the clock has already shifted sides. The attack moves forward, but the advantage it needed has already been spent, and the night will not last forever. Shortly after midnight on 6 to 7 August, the counterattack finally begins. There is no preparatory bombardment, no rolling thunder to announce intent. The decision is deliberate. Surprise, already eroded by delay, is to be preserved by silence. Engines start quietly. Columns ease forward under blackout conditions, metal moving through darkness with only muffled commands and the low churn of tracks against road. In the opening hours, the reports are cautiously encouraging. Forward elements reach Mortain, pushing into the town before defenders fully grasp the scale of the assault. Positions are overrun, prisoners taken. Messages move up the chain suggesting progress, suggesting that momentum, so fragile on paper, might yet exist on the ground. In the dark, movement itself feels like success. But the American infantry does not collapse. Units react not with rigid doctrine, but with improvisation learned over weeks of close combat. Bazooka teams wait at corners and hedgerow gaps, firing at point-blank range before melting back into shadows. Machine guns rake road junctions. Small groups establish roadblocks with whatever is at hand, wrecked vehicles, trees, craters, forcing armor to slow, then stop, then bunch. The German spearhead begins to encounter a truth that maps cannot convey. The hedgerows are not scenery. They are walls of earth and root, chest-high and thick enough to defeat momentum. Tanks cannot simply cross them at will. Infantry moving alongside armor lose cohesion in the maze. Each field becomes its own compartment, each gap a contested doorway. Progress is measured not in kilometers, but in hedges breached and lanes cleared. Radios crackle with partial information. Advance. Resistance. Lost contact. Messages arrive without timestamps, without context, sometimes without replies. Units that believe they are aligned discover they are advancing alone. Others wait for support that is already moving on a different axis. The illusion of control, so carefully assumed in the plan, thins with every transmission. In the darkness, orientation becomes guesswork. Landmarks vanish. Roads branch unexpectedly. Vehicles overshoot turns or miss them entirely. Commanders rely on memory and instinct, guiding men through terrain that offers no overview. The night refuses to clarify whether gains are real or merely local, whether resistance is stiffening or simply unseen. American defenders fight with the same uncertainty. They do not know how deep the thrust will go or how much armor lies behind it. What they do know is where the roads lead and where the enemy must pass. Artillery is called in by sound and flash. Fire missions are adjusted by experience rather than precision. The battlefield becomes intimate, voices, engines, brief flares of light revealing shapes at lethal distances. As hours pass, the pattern repeats. German units push forward, take ground, then slow as resistance thickens at choke points. Infantry clears one hedgerow only to face another. Tanks advance into narrow lanes where flanks cannot be secured. Progress continues, but it is uneven, jagged, difficult to measure. Movement persists without confirmation of purpose. The struggle establishes a grim symmetry. Both sides are fighting blind. Both sides are improvising. Both sides are committing men into uncertainty. But only one side entered the night already anticipated. Only one side's movements are being watched, recorded, and relayed upward into a system prepared to respond. For the Germans, the night is both ally and adversary. It conceals them from air attack, but it also conceals the consequences of delay. The absence of daylight postpones judgment. As long as movement continues, belief can survive. As long as engines are running, the attack feels alive. Yet beneath that motion, the structure is loosening. Timings are no longer synchronized. Objectives blur. Units report success without knowing its relevance. The plan's strength, its dependence on simultaneity, becomes its weakness when simultaneity dissolves. By the early hours of morning, the advance has not failed. but neither has it achieved decision. It has become something else, an accumulation of local actions without a clear centre of gravity. The Germans are moving forward into a night that refuses to tell them whether they are winning or merely occupying time. And time, unseen and unmeasured in the dark, is moving as well. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, beyond the radio range of forward units, another system is waking, one that does not need darkness to function. When morning comes, it will not need to guess where the roads are or who is on them. East of Mortain rises Hill 314, a modest elevation by any dramatic standard. It has no sweeping silhouette, no obvious grandeur. On a peacetime map, it barely registers, a rounded hump overlooking fields and narrow roads. But in a battle defined by movement and visibility, it commands the approaches like a quiet sentinel. Whoever holds it can see where columns must pass, and more importantly, can speak to those who can strike them. Several American companies from the 30th Infantry Division occupy the hill as the German thrust unfolds. Within hours, they are surrounded. Roads leading back are cut. German units flow past and around them, assuming the position will collapse on its own. Isolation, the assumption goes, will produce silence. A pocket without supply, without reinforcement, without escape. Instead, Hill 314 becomes louder. From its crest, observers can still see. Through breaks in the hedgerows and along the snaking roads, German movement reveals itself in fragments, dust, engine noise, glints of steel at first light. Radios remain functional. Coordinates are passed. Artillery batteries beyond the hill's encirclement receive calls that are calm, precise, and relentless. The hill, though surrounded, refuses to become blind. The defenders adapt quickly to their condition. Ammunition is rationed. Casualties are reorganized into ad hoc aid stations dug into the reverse slope. Positions are shifted constantly to avoid pattern. German probes are repelled not with grand counterattacks, but with discipline, fire held until it matters, movement only when necessary. Survival becomes a system, not a gamble. As the days pass, the sky becomes a factor. Allied aircraft, alerted to the defenders' position, begin dropping supplies by parachute. Crates drift down through contested airspace, some landing cleanly, others torn open by fire or impact. Not all reach friendly hands, but enough do. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, each drop turns the sky into a thin lifeline, visible proof that the hill is not forgotten. For the Germans, Hill 314 presents an unwelcome dilemma. Reducing it will cost time, infantry, and coordination, resources already stretched thin. Leaving it alone risks something less tangible but more dangerous, observation. The hill does not need to advance to matter. It only needs to report. Each hour it remains active is another hour German movement is being translated into fire. The choice is deferred, then deferred again. Assaults are launched piecemeal, without the mass needed to overwhelm the position quickly. Each is repulsed. Each failure reinforces the original assumption that the hill is a distraction rather than a fulcrum. The German advance continues past it, flowing westward toward its objectives, carrying with it the belief that the pocket will wither on its own. This is where the small miscalculation sharpens into focus. Hill 314 is treated as a detail, a problem to be solved later, once the real business is done. But in mechanized war, high ground that can see is never a detail. It is a sensor, a relay, a force multiplier. The Germans calculate risk in terms of terrain occupied. They underestimate terrain that observes. The irony deepens with each passing hour. The more the Germans move through the corridor below, the more valuable the hill becomes. Each column exposed to view is another opportunity for artillery to disrupt timing, bunch vehicles, and slow momentum. The defenders do not need to destroy the attack. They only need to interfere with its rhythm. Within the encirclement, the Americans understand none of the broader operational picture. They do not know how far the German thrust has gone or how close it is to Avranches. They measure success in smaller terms, holding until nightfall, holding until the next drop, holding until radios fall silent. Yet their local persistence produces strategic effect. For German commanders, reports from the area grow increasingly frustrating. The hill is contained, yet it continues to speak. It is isolated, yet it still shapes events. The assumption that isolation equals irrelevance proves false. The hill is trapped, but it is not neutralized, and in modern war, those are not the same condition. Hill 314 becomes a moral paradox of the battle. Men cut off from relief exert influence far beyond their perimeter. They do not advance, yet they constrain. They do not break out, yet they help break a plan. Vision, not mobility, becomes their weapon. As the struggle continues, the lesson writes itself quietly into the terrain. A battalion need not maneuver to matter. It need only see and be believed when it speaks. And as long as Hill 314 remains active, the German counterattack is never fully free to move unseen. When daylight strengthens and the skies grow busier, that unseen cost will become visible. What the hill observes by day, others will soon strike from above. By morning, the German columns are exactly where the plan required them to be and where the battlefield punishes them most. They are on roads, moving through open stretches between hedgerows and villages, compressed into lines dictated by terrain rather than intent. What had been concealment in darkness becomes exposure in light. Shapes sharpen. Distances shorten. Geometry reveals itself. As the light strengthens, Allied coordination tightens with it. Ground observers, some forward with infantry, others elevated on high ground like Hill 314, begin to translate sightings into grid references. Radios carry these observations rearward, where artillery batteries and air controllers are already primed. The process is not hurried. It is practiced. Sight becomes signal, signal becomes strike. The Germans had hoped weather and speed would protect them. Cloud cover, early fog, rapid movement, each was expected to blur the enemy's response. Instead, daylight arrives as an audit. The fog lifts unevenly, just enough to expose roads without fully concealing them. Speed diminishes under congestion. What remains is a pattern visible from above and traceable from the ground. Pilots and gunners do not need heroics to exploit this pattern. They require only clear targets and repeatable routines. Columns on roads provide both. Artillery fires to halt the lead vehicles. Aircraft strike to disrupt the rear. The intent is not annihilation in a single blow, but immobilization. Once stopped, a column becomes vulnerable by definition. The battlefield begins to feel industrial. Vehicles are knocked out in predictable places, at bridges, bends, and choke points. Smoke rises not from one decisive impact, but from many small ones, spaced along the route like punctuation. Crews abandon disabled armor under fire, seeking cover that offers concealment but no escape. The space between front and rear fills with stalled machines and blocked intentions. German momentum falters without a clear moment of collapse. There is no single catastrophic strike to mark the turn. Instead, punishment accumulates. Each delay invites another strike. Each strike compounds the next delay. Time, once the Germans' most precious resource, becomes the mechanism of their erosion. Attempts to restore movement only deepen the problem. Vehicles leave the road to bypass wreckage and bog down in fields. Units detour onto secondary routes that lead into the same congestion. Commanders issue orders to disperse, then to regroup, then to press on, each instruction colliding with conditions it cannot undo. The network of movement tightens into a knot. Allied systems thrive in this environment. Artillery does not need to see every target, it needs only reliable observers. Aircraft do not need to destroy every vehicle, they need to disrupt flow. The integration of air and ground turns observation into leverage. What the Germans experience as chaos, the Allies experience as confirmation. For the men on the ground, the change is immediate and visceral. Movement draws attention. Stopping invites attack. Camouflage hides shape but not location. Crews begin to move like hunted men, driving in short bursts, pausing under cover, measuring risk in seconds rather than objectives. The psychological shift is as important as the physical one. Initiative drains away, replaced by caution. The counterattack's logic begins to unravel. Speed was meant to outrun response. Mass was meant to overwhelm resistance. Neither can function once the columns are fixed in place. The plan does not collapse outright, it dissolves. Forward units wait for support that cannot arrive. Rear units push into bottlenecks that cannot clear. This is the hinge of the struggle. Once air power can see, time stops being neutral. Every minute favors the side with the better network. The Germans do not need to be defeated immediately, they only need to be slowed. A counterattack that must finish quickly has no defense against a response designed to make it finish slowly. As the morning wears on, the sky grows busier. Radios grow more urgent. Reports grow less coherent. The attack is still moving in places, still fighting, still inflicting losses. But its shape has changed. What began as a coordinated thrust has become a series of local survivals. The question is no longer whether the Germans can reach the coast. It is whether they can extract what they have already committed. And above the roads of Normandy, the answer is being written, one strike at a time. On the 7th of August, the sky over the Mortagne sector changes character. What had been a variable, weather, cloud, chance, hardens into a constant. IF typhoons arrive in sustained force, not as isolated sorties but as a system in motion. Hundreds of flights sweep the corridor throughout the day, their schedules overlapping, their presence persistent. The counterattack, conceived for speed and darkness, is now exposed to daylight and routine. The doctrine is simple and ruthless. Find the column. Halt it. Then dismantle it. Rockets and bombs strike road-bound armor where movement is least forgiving, at bends, bridges and bottlenecks already strained by congestion. A single hit at the head freezes everything behind it. A strike at the rear seals the trap. Between the two, vehicles accumulate, engines idling or burning, crews waiting for an opening that never comes. The Germans attempt to adapt. Columns scatter into fields and tree lines, vehicles nosing off the road in search of concealment. But concealment is not movement. Tanks that leave the road lose coordination and speed. Assault guns bog down in soft ground. Recovery vehicles cannot reach the damaged. What was meant to be dispersion becomes paralysis, each machine hidden but stranded, safe for the moment and useless for the mission. The typhoons return again and again, low and fast, their approach announced by a distinct, rising roar. Pilots do not need to improvise. They follow patterns rehearsed since the Normandy landings, identify the road, strike the blockage, circle, strike again. Rockets punch through armor or detonate among closely packed vehicles. Bombs crater the asphalt, ensuring that even intact machines cannot pass. The air war is not dramatic, it is methodical. With each pass, Luftwaffe expectations collapse further. German planners had assumed some degree of contest, interference, delay, a thinning of Allied effort. Instead, the air above Normandy belongs largely to the Allies. German fighters are scarce, fuel-starved, and outmatched. Anti-aircraft fire remains, but it is localized and reactive. It cannot clear the sky, it can only protest it. The counterattack's character changes under this pressure. What was designed as an advance becomes an exercise in survival. Units focus less on reaching objectives and more on recovering vehicles, evacuating wounded, and finding routes that avoid exposure. Orders shift in tone. Press on gives way to hold, then to withdraw if possible. The timetable that once governed movement now measures loss. The turning point is not purely destructive. It is psychological. Crews begin to drive differently, short bursts of speed, abrupt halts, constant scanning of the sky. Engines are cut under cover. Vehicles are abandoned not because they are destroyed, but because they are visible. Fear is not the presence of aircraft, it is the certainty of their return. Men learn quickly that any movement in daylight invites attention. This psychological weight spreads through the formation. Reports emphasize air attack over enemy ground action. Delays are explained not by resistance ahead, but by exposure above. Initiative drains away as decision-making narrows to avoidance. The counterattack's internal logic, speed, mass, momentum cannot survive this inversion. A force designed to move fast now measures success by how little it moves at all. Attempts to reassert control fail. Staff officers urge renewed concentration, renewed effort, renewed push. But concentration only sharpens targets, and renewed effort only extends exposure. The roads, once arteries of advance, become liabilities that draw fire. Detours promise safety but deliver isolation. Every choice trades time for risk, and time no longer belongs to the Germans. From above, the battlefield appears ordered. Columns fixed in place. Vehicles dispersed in predictable patterns. Smoke marking recent strikes. From below, it feels chaotic: noise, shock, confusion, and the constant calculation of when to move and when to freeze. But disparity itself is decisive. One side sees the whole, the other sees fragments. By afternoon, losses mount in a way that cannot be repaired. Tanks are not merely damaged, they are destroyed or abandoned. Crews are not merely shaken, they are depleted. Each loss reduces the capacity to resume the attack, even if conditions were to improve. The counterattack's reserve, the margin that allows recovery, evaporates under repeated strikes. The miscalculation now stands exposed. The timetable assumed the sky would be neutral, a backdrop rather than a participant. It was not. The sky becomes an executioner, enforcing penalties for every delay already incurred. Hours donated the previous night are collected with interest. What could have been fleeting exposure becomes sustained vulnerability. As the day wears on, the outcome is no longer in doubt. The question is no longer whether the counterattack can succeed, but how much of it can be salvaged. The plan's promise, to reach the coast, to sever the breakout, has been stripped down to a narrower hope to survive the daylight with enough strength to withdraw. Above the roads of Normandy, the typhoons continue their circuits, indifferent to intention and unmoved by resolve. Below them, the German counterattack contracts, its motion replaced by calculation, its ambition by endurance. The sky has opened, and with it, the limits of the plan have become impossible to ignore. By the afternoon of the 7th of August, the shape of the German counterattack has changed in ways the original plan never anticipated. American 7 Corps moves to contain the thrust, pressing against its exposed sides rather than meeting it head-on. What was intended as a clean breakthrough now protrudes awkwardly into Allied lines, a narrow salient whose depth becomes a liability rather than an advantage. Allied armour begins to work the flanks with deliberate pressure. Tanks and tank destroyers engage German units not as a single mass, but as separated elements struggling to maintain coherence. Each push against the sides tightens the corridor, transforming forward German units into isolated assets whose presence ahead of the main body complicates withdrawal. What had been the spearhead becomes a weight dragging the rest of the formation. Orders from above struggle to keep pace with this shift. Initial directives still speak the language of attack: press on, exploit openings, regain momentum. As reports filter upward, that language changes. Hold ground. Secure lines. Prepare to disengage. The transitions come quickly, but not cleanly. Communications lag behind events, and events refuse to pause while instructions catch up. This delay in transmission produces a fatal split. Some units receive orders to pull back and begin disengaging under fire. Others, still operating on earlier instructions, dig into whole terrain that no longer serves a purpose. The result is fragmentation without intent. Movement becomes unsynchronized not by choice, but by confusion. Units that retreat expose neighbors that remain. Units that remain block routes needed by those trying to leave. Hill 314 continues to complicate every attempt at reorganization. Still active, still observing, it denies the Germans the clean rear area required to regroup. Artillery called from its slopes continues to interdict movement, turning roads behind the German advance into contested space. The hill's presence transforms withdrawal into another series of risks, rather than a relief from them. Within the salient, the counterattack's narrative collapses. It is no longer framed as a drive to the coast or a decisive blow against Patton's advance. The language changes in briefings and reports. Objectives shrink. Time horizons shorten. The goal becomes extraction, getting men and machines out before the corridor closes further. American pressure increases methodically. Infantry advances to secure villages along the sides of the thrust. Armor positions to cut roads rather than chase units. Artillery brackets likely withdrawal routes. The containment is not dramatic, it is systematic. The protrusion is allowed to exist just long enough to be constrained. For German commanders on the ground, decision-making narrows to survival calculations. Which units can still move? Which roads are still passable? Which losses can be absorbed, and which cannot? The plan offers no guidance for this phase because it was never designed to reach it. Improvisation fills the gap, but improvisation without time is simply reaction. The sense of being watched intensifies. Aircraft circle overhead. Observation posts report movement almost as soon as it begins. Attempts to regroup are disrupted by fire before they can consolidate. Every effort to impose order reveals itself and is punished accordingly. The battlefield has become transparent to one side and opaque to the other. As daylight fades, the Germans face a narrowing set of options. Withdraw in daylight and risk air attack. Wait for darkness and risk encirclement. Hold ground and risk becoming irrelevant to the larger fight. Each choice carries cost and none offer recovery. The salient continues to tighten, its sides pressed inward by forces that do not need to hurry. This is where Rout begins, not in panic, but in logic. The plan that once provided direction no longer applies. Its assumptions, speed, mass, surprise, are no longer operative. Without them, the counterattack becomes a collection of local decisions unconnected to a larger purpose. Men still fight. Units still hold discipline. But the idea that binds them together has dissolved. The moment is subtle and therefore decisive. No line breaks. No order declares defeat. Instead, the logic evaporates. The attack ceases to be something that can succeed, even in theory. What remains is the management of consequences. As night approaches, German units begin to think less about where they are going and more about where they must not remain. The thrust that once pointed westward now bends inward, folding back on itself. The question that dominates every report is no longer how to advance, but how to escape. And beyond the narrowing pocket, Allied forces continue to move, already preparing for what follows once the counterattack has exhausted itself. By 8th of August, the German counteroffensive has crossed an invisible threshold. There is no longer a plausible path to success, only pathways of withdrawal under mounting pressure. Movement westward ceases to have meaning. Movement eastward becomes survival. What remains of the attack exists in fragments, each trying to disengage without becoming trapped by the very roads that once promised speed. Tanks and assault guns are lost steadily, relentlessly. Some are destroyed outright by air attack or artillery. Others are abandoned after mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, or blocked routes make recovery impossible. Crews disable what they can before leaving, knowing that even intact vehicles left behind will soon be claimed. The numbers accumulate not as a single catastrophe, but as an attritional certainty Germany cannot reverse. Here the battlefield exposes a brutal modern truth. Equipment losses are no longer temporary setbacks when industry is asymmetric. For the Allies, destroyed vehicles are replaced by production schedules that run ahead of demand. For Germany, each loss narrows future options. Armour destroyed at Mortain cannot be rebuilt in time to matter. Crews lost cannot be trained quickly enough to replace experience. The counterattack is not merely failing, it is consuming the future. Survivors describe the days that follow in the same language. Constant air attack, roads blocked by wreckage, long waits under cover, broken by frantic dashes between hedgerows, the helplessness of being visible. Even when aircraft are not overhead, their absence feels temporary. Every sound from the sky triggers reflexive stillness. Movement becomes an act of risk calculation rather than command. German lines begin to reel along a broader front. Units that were not part of the counterattack feel its consequences as reserves vanish and gaps widen. The failed thrust at Mortain accelerates a larger danger taking shape to the north and east. Allied forces press inward, exploiting weakness and momentum. What was meant to stabilize the front instead hastens the conditions for encirclement. The connection to Falaise becomes clear in hindsight, but its foundations are laid here. Armor that might have slowed Allied advances is gone. Units that might have formed a coherent defense are disorganized or depleted. The counterattack has not merely failed, it has reshaped the balance of forces at precisely the wrong moment. What began as an offensive ends as a hemorrhage. Men and machines stream eastward through constricted routes, often under fire, often without clear direction. Withdrawal orders overlap with contradictory instructions to hold. Some units escape intact. Others dissolve into columns of survivors without heavy equipment. Discipline persists, but cohesion does not always survive the pressure. The psychological toll deepens alongside the material one. Crews who entered the battle expecting a decisive strike now measure success by distance gained away from the enemy. Commanders focus on preventing annihilation rather than achieving effect. The horizon of ambition collapses from victory to endurance. The terrain compounds every problem. Bridges become choke points under attack. Villages that once offered cover now funnel retreating units into predictable paths. Night provides some relief, but not recovery. Losses incurred by day cannot be undone by darkness. Each sunrise resets the threat. By 13th August, the accounting is unavoidable. Germany has traded its last operational reserve in the west for a few days of false hope. The armor lost at Mortain will not reappear at the Seine or at the German border or in the Ardennes with the same strength. The decision to gamble has removed the ability to choose later. The turning point completes not with surrender or collapse, but with exhaustion of possibility. The counterattack's failure closes doors rather than opening them. What remains of German strength is forced into reaction, shaping the remainder of the campaign around defense and delay. In retrospect, the rout does not begin when men flee or lines break. It begins when replacement becomes impossible, when losses stop being recoverable and start becoming permanent. Mortain marks that shift with quiet finality. The attack had been calculated to the minute. Its consequences will be measured for the rest of the war. With the counterattack spent, the battlefield around Mortain grows quieter, but the war does not pause. Allied forces gain something more valuable than territory: freedom of maneuver. The pressure that had briefly bent westward now turns north, tightening around German formations, struggling to re-establish coherence. What the counterattack was meant to arrest instead accelerates movement elsewhere. The strategic meaning of Mortain quickly outgrows its geography. The failed thrust does not merely end an operation, it reshapes the campaign. German units that might have anchored a flexible defense are gone, scattered, or immobilized. Gaps appear where resistance should have thickened. Into those gaps, Allied forces press, no longer constrained by the fear of a major armored riposte. For German commanders, the reckoning is immediate and unsparing. The ledger makes no allowance for intention. Armor losses are tallied not as tactical setbacks, but as strategic amputations. Crews are missing, fuel depots empty, communications fractured. Cohesion, the invisible glue that holds formations together, has been consumed by movement under fire and orders that arrived too late to matter. There is no dramatic collapse in command. Instead, there is a narrowing of options. Units that survive are tasked with holding longer lines with fewer resources. Defensive plans are drafted around absence rather than strength. Mortain becomes a reference point in reports, not as a place of fighting, but as a source of loss. Allied commanders draw a different lesson. They do not conclude that the enemy is incapable of striking back. Mortain proves the opposite. The Germans can still assemble armor, still launch counterattacks, still inflict damage. But they cannot sustain. Once committed, their blows cannot be repaired, replenished, or repeated at scale. This understanding informs what comes next. Operational tempo increases. Allied forces accept risk where before they might have hesitated. Maneuver replaces caution. The enemy's inability to recover becomes an exploitable constant rather than a hoped-for outcome. Mortain clarifies the balance of endurance, and endurance now favors one side decisively. The battlefield itself bears witness to this shift. Burned vehicles line the roads, many destroyed not in combat, but in withdrawal. Cratered intersections mark repeated airstrikes. Villages that once anchored movements now sit damaged and emptied, their names destined for footnotes rather than headlines. The geography absorbs the cost quietly, without ceremony. Survivors carry different memories. Some recall the constant pressure from above, the sound of aircraft, the impossibility of movement in daylight. Others remember the confusion of orders, the sense that decisions no longer connected to outcomes. Few speak of Mortain as a battle that was lost. More describe it as a place where the future ran out. From the Allied perspective, the meaning sharpens with each passing day. The door to Falaise is no longer theoretical. The conditions for encirclement, mobility, air superiority, weakened resistance are falling into place. Mortain does not cause the coming disaster alone, but it removes the last serious obstacle to it. This is consequence in its purest form. Not punishment, not drama, but momentum that becomes irreversible. Once the counterattack fails, the war's direction hardens. Choices narrow, recovery becomes delay, delay becomes retreat. Mortain is thus remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it made inevitable. A gamble meant to restore initiative instead surrenders it entirely. The loss is not measured only in tanks or men, but in the disappearance of alternatives. As the front shifts and new battles loom to the north, the lesson settles in quietly. Time, once misread, cannot be reclaimed. The minutes lost before Mortain now compound into weeks, then months, then defeat. And somewhere along the narrowing roads toward Falaise, the consequences of that small miscalculation begin to close in. Seen in isolation, no single decision at Mortain appears catastrophic. The failure is not dramatic enough for that. It unfolds as a chain, small, sequential, and therefore harder to arrest. A delay in concentration. A loss of simultaneity. Exposure that arrives not because of recklessness, but because daylight arrives on schedule. Each link is survivable on its own. Together, they form a mechanism. The first link is time lost before the attack even begins. Hours slip as units struggle to assemble, as coordination frays, as caution competes with urgency. That delay fractures concentration. Forces meant to strike together instead arrive in sequence. Momentum, which depends on overlap, dissolves into a series of local efforts that cannot reinforce one another quickly enough. The second link is exposure. Once the timetable slips, darkness no longer covers movement long enough to protect it. Roads that might have been crossed unseen become visible. Columns that might have dispersed after breakthrough remain compressed when the light arrives. The plan does not fail immediately, but it becomes vulnerable in ways it was never designed to endure. Added to this chain is the unseen cut, Allied foreknowledge. German planners assume they are racing reaction. In reality, they are racing preparation that has already occurred. Air support is not scrambled in response, it is cued in anticipation. Artillery is not hastily aligned, it is pre-positioned. The Germans lose time twice, once through delay and again because the enemy never needed it. This asymmetry defines the battle. The Germans assume surprise can replace air cover. That speed will compensate for exposure. The Allies assume air cover can replace mass. That observation and repetition can compensate for numerical limits on the ground. Both assumptions are rational. Only one is correct under the conditions that emerge. Hill 314 crystallizes this imbalance. It is overlooked not because it is invisible, but because it appears marginal. A single elevation, lightly held, cut off early, yet it refuses to become irrelevant. As long as it can see, it can speak. As long as it can speak, it can shape events far beyond its perimeter. Time spent ignoring it becomes time paid elsewhere. The moral psychology of the battle is quiet and unspectacular. Men do not collapse from fear alone. They endure danger constantly. What erodes them is the sense that effort no longer produces effect, that movement invites punishment, that orders no longer align with outcomes, that systems no longer reward competence. When the structure of action stops making sense, discipline begins to thin. This is how time becomes a weapon, not as a ticking clock, but as an organizing principle. The side that can afford delay absorbs it. The side that cannot is shaped by it. Almost on time becomes a category with consequences. In modern operations, precision is not an advantage, it is a requirement. Mortain demonstrates this with austere clarity. The German counterattack does not fail because it lacks courage or professionalism. It fails because its success depends on minutes it cannot spare. The Allies do not win because they are flawless, but because their systems are resilient to delay and ruthless in exploiting it. War, in this sense, punishes approximation. A plan that works only if everything aligns perfectly is already fragile. A response that works even when it does not is decisive. At Mortain, that difference is measured not in days or even hours, but in intervals small enough to be dismissed, until they accumulate. The listener is left with a sober insight. In mechanized, networked war, minutes are not small. They are structural. They determine whether systems synchronize or collide, whether exposure is brief or fatal, whether belief survives first contact with daylight. Time, misread once, does not forgive repetition. And at Mortain, it is time, not tanks or generals, that ultimately decides the outcome. Mortain can be read as a parable of late war Germany, not because it is unique, but because it is representative. Boldness is demanded by politics at the center, while payment is extracted from units at the edge. The counterattack is conceived as an assertion of will, a refusal to accept strategic decline. Its costs, however, are borne by formations already worn thin, asked to convert belief into movement under conditions belief cannot change. The promise at the heart of the plan, reach the coast, is revealed in retrospect as a fantasy built on fragile assumptions. It assumes surprise will last, that speed will compensate for exposure, that the enemy will react slowly enough to be outrun. None of these assumptions are irrational in isolation. Together, they require mercy from a battlefield that offers none. What defeats the counterattack is not a single weapon or commander, but the convergence of systems. Air power denies movement. Intelligence denies surprise. Terrain denies flexibility. Each element alone is manageable. Combined, they form something more than tactics. They deny second chances. Once the timetable slips, there is no mechanism to recover it. Once daylight arrives, there is no refuge that allows momentum to resume. The human cost emerges without ornament. On Hill 314, surrounded men hold on not because they expect rescue, but because holding still matters. On the roads below, burned-out vehicles mark places where crews made calculations and lost. In villages caught between columns and airstrikes, civilians endure the consequences of plans drawn far away. These are not symbols. They are outcomes. There is no moral drama imposed on these scenes. The men involved act professionally, often courageously, within the limits they are given. The tragedy lies not in failure of character, but in the structure that demands execution without adaptability. When plans depend on flawless timing, they leave no space for human variability. When they break, they do so all at once. The final irony is historical and precise. Germany's last offensive energy in the West is not spent on building a defense in depth, nor on trading space for time. It is spent on a gamble whose conditions the enemy already understands. The counterattack does not surprise the Allies into hesitation. It confirms their assessment. It does not restore initiative. It clarifies its absence. After Mortain, the German army continues to fight. It retreats, reorganizes, resists. But it does so without the operational freedom it has just expended. What remains is endurance, not choice. The war narrows into a sequence of delays rather than opportunities, each shaped by losses that cannot be replaced. In this sense, Mortain is not remembered for what it achieves, but for what it exhausts. It consumes the last margin between risk and necessity. After it, every decision is defensive, every movement constrained, every recovery partial. The future contracts. The story closes, then, not on a battlefield tableau, but on an abstraction made concrete. The real protagonist is not a general issuing orders, nor a tank advancing down a road. It is time itself, measured, allocated, misjudged. Time that must be synchronized to succeed, and that punishes those who assume it will wait. At Mortain, time does not wait. It accumulates interest on every delay, exposes every assumption, and enforces every consequence without malice or exception. It offers no second draft of the plan. They calculated a counterattack to the minute, and lost the war in the minutes they misread.